Welcome to Homeschool Conversations with Humility and Doxology, a series of conversations with real-life homeschool moms, dads, and other educators. I'm Amy Sloan, a second-generation homeschooling mom of 5, and I am delighted that you are here today to chat with me or overhear my chat with Angelina Stanford. Thank you, Angelina, for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
Well, Angelina has an honors baccalaureate degree and a master's degree in English literature from the University of Louisiana, graduating Phi Kappa Phi. For over 25 years, she has shared her passion and enthusiasm for literature with students in a variety of settings, from university classrooms to homeschool co-ops to homeschooling her own 3 children. In 2012, she entered the world of online teaching, creating a unique online community and mentor relationship with her students. And this year, in 2020, she founded with her husband, Thomas Banks, the House of Humane Letters, providing classes, conferences, and other resources for a more humane education. Angelina maintains a high commitment to teaching teachers and students the skill and art of reading well, and in recapturing the tradition of literary scholarship needed to fully engage with the great books. You may also know her from the Literary Life podcast, which she co-hosts with her husband and her longtime friend, Cindy Rollins, which is certainly a delight in my earbuds. And today we're going to be focusing on the topic of fairy tales, which I'm super excited about. But first, Angelina, can you just give us a little bit of a glimpse into who you are and your family and your literary background?
Okay, well, I grew up in Louisiana. I'm a Cajun, so bona fide. You've got a Cajun girl. I don't know that I have much to add to the bio. So I went through academic training, and I was on the PhD track to become a professor, and I decided instead, I got, for a number of reasons, extremely disillusioned with academia, and I quit and had a baby. I decided to go be a homeschooler, much to the shock and scorn of my colleagues. They were very disappointed in me. So I did that. And I homeschooled my 3 kids. The 2 oldest are in their 20s now. I have 1 left still at home. My oldest son has shocked me by becoming an English major. So he's a senior English major. So that, of course, I love that. Now I'm in North Carolina, and I am a newlywed. We are just celebrating our 1st anniversary in June.
Congratulations.
Thank you, and it's a lot of fun. I'm married to my own personal poet, so that's wonderful. He's a poet and a classicist, and we get to work together and really craft a literary life, which is pretty amazing. I'm having a pinch myself life right now that I get to spend all my time engaged in my favorite thing in the world, which is talking about stories. And God continues to give me more and more avenues for that. One of the great ironic things is that I left the academic world to be a full-time homeschool mom. And honestly, got involved in online, never thought that I would be anything other than just, take care of my own kids kind of thing. And through a series of things, just out of a necessity, I started teaching online and because I needed the income. And it was one of those things where I was like, well, my 2 olders were in high school. And so I just thought, well, I'll offer to other people what I'm teaching them. And then it just sort of grew and grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. So now that I'm teaching, just a full selection of classes, middle school to adult, and I've got this podcast and conferences and webinars, and God just continues to open doors for me to talk about stories, which is amazing to me. I mean, if I didn't have those doors, I would just be at home talking about it to myself or my husband or my kids. But so I feel like my day-to-day life is actually pretty the same. But God, I apparently this is a message God wants me to share, and so I humbly embrace the doors that He kind of pushes me through, sometimes unwillingly.
I remember when I was a kid growing up, I was like, if only there were a job where I could get paid to read books. And I feel like you've kind of lucked out and found that very job.
Yep, it's true. It's true. Don't hate me because my job is to read. This is true. This is true. I absolutely, I sometimes in the morning fix myself a big cup of coffee, sit in a chair with a stack of books and think, wow, this is my job. How did I manage this? This is amazing.
That's fantastic. Well, I know that you love all types of different genres and aspects of literature, but one thing I've heard you mention repeatedly, and I think you might even be working on a book about this, is about your great love for fairy tales. So I was wondering, have you always loved fairy tales? Was that something from childhood, or where did sort of your love for fairy tales come from?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. So when I was 3 years old, my dad gave me a copy. It was a kind of a young reader's adaptation of the Arabian Nights, and it was called 1001 Nights, and I probably read it 1001 times. When I learned to read at 4 years old, that book was my ever companion. And I read it and read it and read it and loved it. And the Arabian Tales, if your listeners don't know, is a collection of Persian and Mediterranean and Indian fairy tales. One of the things I have discovered in my scholarly research that has just sort of delighted me is that almost all of my sort of literary heroes were also madly in love with the Arabian Nights and were greatly influenced by it when it was published in French in the 1700s. So they're medieval tales, and I was just absolutely smitten with them. In fact, growing up, I never read a European fairy tale. I only read the Arabian Nights. And I was particularly just absolutely enchanted with the framing device of the stories, the story of Scheherazade, the girl who has to tell these stories for 1001 nights in order to save her life. And it's so funny to me when I look back on it, because if you're familiar at all with my work, you know my tagline is stories will save the world. And here I am at 4 years old, obsessed with a book in which the message is stories will save your life and stories will save the world. So I feel like that was imprinted on me really, really early. Oddly enough, no, I did not read any European fairy tales. And I heard them told, you know, my mom would tell them. And of course, I've seen movie versions of things, but I never sat down and read them. I became, as a kid, what I liked to read after that was mythology. So I read a lot of mythology. And it really wasn't until in college I took a folklore class. And we began to read the folk tales and read all the different versions of like Cinderella from all the different parts of the world. And my imagination was very, very captured by that. So yeah, I came to European fairy tales by a very long and weird route.
That is fascinating. Actually, interestingly, in my book club, my in real life book club, although it hasn't been in real life recently, but we read the Arabian Nights. So it was not the full collection, but we read one of the versions, and we paired it with Green Mantle by John Buchan or Buchan. I don't know. I was homeschooled. I don't know how to pronounce it. Buchan. So that was a really delightful pair and interesting to see overlapping themes and ideas. So yeah. Well,
absolutely.
Before we get down sort of this rabbit trail discussion about fairy tales, I think it's really going to be important for us to define our terms. So do you think there are any misconceptions that we have about what makes a fairy tale a fairy tale? Are there things that we call fairy tales that aren't fairy tales? Are there things maybe we don't think are fairy tales that might secretly be fairy tales? How would you define a fairy tale?
Okay, I love this question. I absolutely love this question because yes, you are correct about all of those questions. First of all, there is a great deal of scholarly debate about what is a fairy tale. There is a great deal of scholarly debate about what are the characteristics of a fairy tale, where they came from, how did they come into existence. It is a very complicated question. Fortunately, I've studied this. My scholarly academic training comes in handy, you know, so I deep dive into these things. So I've really studied this, and so I think I can give us a few categories that will really help us to make sense of it. So if you've read, and I highly recommend, J.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, he also deals with this question of what makes a fairy story and what is not a fairy story. One of the things you'll discover is that not all fairy tales have fairies in them. Not all fairy tales have magic. Not every story with magic is a fairy tale. In fact, he says, and this is such a great quote, the history of fairy stories is probably more complex than the history of the human race. And that is because fairy tales are an expression of what is essentially human. And so it has, you find them all over the world in lots of different expressions, and they change over time. So when you're talking about a fairy tale, and again, to make it even more complicated, the term fairy tale is a fairly new in the history of literature term. It's a term that comes to us in the 1600s, and is not necessarily, in fact, the Grimm brothers don't necessarily call their stuff fairy tales. Their original book was Tales of the Folk tales, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and also wonder tales. So one thing you can do to think about what is a fairy tale is that is a wonder story. I'm sure we'll unpack that a lot more. So basically, there are two essential components if you're asking the question, what is a fairy tale? One is the way it begins, and the other is the way it ends. So that's very easy, right? I teach this to my students in my middle class. I get them all to like recite it back to me. So a fairy tale is going to begin always, without exception, with some version of once upon a time, in a land far away, in a kingdom in the forest. In other words, it is going to be vague about exactly when it's happening, and it is going to be vague about exactly where it's happening. So if your story starts off in the days of King Arthur, not a fairy tale, even if it's got magic. Okay, it's a legend actually. So if it's naming a particular person, if it's naming a particular time, if it says in 1492, if it says in the reign of so-and-so, you're not dealing with a fairy tale. You're dealing with one of the other types of stories. So it's always going to be vague. What we call this is a displacement of time and space. A fairy tale always displaces the reader, and it's very intentional. It's because fairy tales are stories of the everyman. And so by making them not really sure when and not really sure where, it could be any time. It could be right now. It could be anywhere. It could be where you are. In fact, going further with this everyman theme, one of the things you'll find is that the main characters in a fairy tale are not named. They are nicknamed. Red Riding Hood, Cinderella is a nickname, Sleeping Beauty is a nickname. Where they do have a name, like Hansel or Gretel, those are basically the German equivalent of, Jane Doe, Jack and Jill, okay? So the idea is that the protagonist of the story, the hero of the story, could be anyone. It could be you. You could find yourself lost in the forest. You could find yourself victimized by two horrible stepsisters. Any of this could be happening to you anytime and anywhere. So that's number one about a fairy tale. It's going to start with some sort of displacement of time and space. The other thing is the way that a fairy tale ends. So this often shocks people when I say this, because again, we have a lot of incorrect notions about what is a fairy tale. A lot of times we think, well, if it was in my collection of fairy tales, it is a fairy tale. And I'll explain especially in this episode why Andrew Lang includes many, many things that are not fairy tales. And Tolkien actually rips him for some of those choices, in the way that only Tolkien could do, meaning that he ripped Lang at a commemorative event for Andrew Lang, in which he gave a speech and said, these are not fairy tales and should not be in a collection of fairy tales. So,
oh my goodness.
We scholars get excited about weird things, like our hills I always say, my hills to die on have no one else to die on them. There's so much room for me to just sprawl out and die. I'm not over here way by myself. So a fairy tale, by definition, has to have a happy ending. If it does not have a happy ending, it's not a fairy tale, it's a cautionary tale.
Okay.
But sometimes our collections will throw all of them together under the name fairy tale. Tolkien talks a lot about this in his essay on fairy stories, talks about the eucatastrophe, and so the way that there's that reversal at the end. Another way to think about it is that a fairy tale, by definition, is a redemption story. That's why it has to have the happy ending. So this character is going on some kind of journey, there's tests and quests and impossible tasks, and at the end, they are redeemed. So that's your two basic components. Okay, now, to add on top of that, the term fairy tale, okay? So you have folk tales. Folk tales come to us from the oral tradition. We don't know where they came from. You just find them everywhere. Folklorists gather them up, and there they are, a million Cinderellas. Egypt's got a Cinderella, China's got we've all got the same story in a slightly varied form all over the world. Every time somebody thinks they've figured out, oh, this is the first fairy tale, here's the date, somebody finds one older. It's a huge area of, we need an Indiana Jones of the fairy tale world, right, to go out there and to excavate the truth for us. So that's a folk tale. So when you're dealing with something like Grimm's, those are actually folk tales, and that was the original term for these tales. The term fairy tale, I know I'm going to take you on some twists and turns because it's confusing how we end up with our modern thought of, well, this is a fairy tale. In the 1600s in France, some of the writers began to write stories they called contes de fées, fairy tales. They were not from the folk tradition. They were literary works of the imagination. They were basically short stories. And they called them fairy tales because they had fairy godmothers in them and things like that. But they do not come from the folk tradition and are not rooted in anything of a larger oral history. It's basically like, you picking up an Edgar Allan Poe short story collection. Well, that's what you would have done back then. And it was somebody's collection of stories about fairies, right? Now, that becomes very, very popular. They were not written for children. They were written for adults. And many of them were sort of politically subversive, okay? Most of those tales we don't read anymore, with one exception that I'll now tell you about. Okay, so probably the single biggest confusion I run into when somebody's asking me about fairy tales is the difference between the Grimm brothers and Charles Perrault, the French fairy tale brother. Okay, so most of us are actually more familiar with Perrault than we are with Grimm, and this is why it's so important then to explain all of this. Charles Perrault was a French bureaucrat, and in the court of Louis XIV, so Versailles, one of the most decadent times in history, where if you lived at court, there was every kind of horrific immorality, right? They make our Hollywood stars look like nothing. Sunday school teachers, right? This was the French court. This was bad. Now, Charles Perrault was a reformer and believed that stories could be used to reform. So here's what he did. He took, and this is where you're going to see exactly how we got the confusion. He, unlike his contemporaries who made up stories, he took the folk tales and changed them. He rewrote them with a very specific didactic purpose. In other words, we have all this immorality in the court. I'm going to write the Elsie Dinsmore version of fairy tales.
I was just thinking.
Yep. Okay. It is. You're going to, yeah. I'm going to write the Elsie Dinsmore version of these tales to warn everybody about their bad behavior. So he introduces lots of new elements to the stories and a lot of times chops off the happy ending. Like in Red Riding Hood. If you're like, well, Red Riding Hood doesn't have a happy ending, you haven't read the right one. You've read the Charles Perrault version. I'll give you some examples of what he did, but there was this show on PBS a while back when my kids were little, so probably like 20 years ago, but I forget what it was called. You might remember, but the PBS show had cartoons acting out fairy tales, and they changed the fairy tales radically to serve some social purpose. So for example, they retold the fable of the tortoise and the hare, and at the end, the tortoise slows down, wakes up the hare, they hold hands and cross the finish line together because we're all winners, okay? Okay, so if that offends you, then Charles Perrault should offend you because that is exactly what he did, okay? So for example, follow me here. You take the Grimm's version of and I know this is gonna bust some bubbles here. You take the Grimm's, the folk tale version of Cinderella, exists all over the world, does not have a fairy godmother, does not have a 12 o'clock curfew. You can look all over the world, it's not there. It was in Charles Perrault's imagination. Now why? Because in the folktale, it is Cinderella's native virtue and the Holy Spirit in the shape of her dead mother who guides her in the virtuous path. No, that's not going to work for Charles Perrault. What do young girls need at the French court? A chaperone, a curfew. You see where we're going here. All right, so he's changing things for this very specific didactic purpose. Not only that, and you'll love this, he slapped on morals at the end of each tale, lest you miss the point, okay? Right, but yeah. So the original Aesop's fables actually did not have morals. They were added in the 17th century in France, and an edition that had come out, and Charles Perrault thought, this is brilliant. Yes, spell it out. Make sure we don't miss the point. And so he rewrites the. So, for example, he rewrites Little Red Riding Hood. Ramps up the sexual nature of the encounter with the wolf, which is not in the folktale, but oh my, what big arms you have, what big teeth, really ramps it up. Makes the heroine a little bit older, gives her a sassy French writing habit, chops off the happy ending. So in his version, Little Red Riding Hood has her little seductive encounter with the wolf and then is devoured, the end. And he slaps on this little moral. Ladies, if you get into a bed with a wolf, you're gonna get eaten alive. Which is a wonderful and true message, but is not a fairy tale. His moral that he slapped on for Sleeping Beauty is that long engagements are good, but girls are so impatient and never want to wait.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, yes. That is Charles Perrault, who called his book Mother Goose's Tales. Now, Mother Goose has come to mean something else too. Charles Perrault's just a mess. He's made a mess of all things for us. It's so confusing. Now, the true difficulty, so Charles Perrault publishes his book. Unfortunately, because they're so based on the folk tales, the weird thing happens where Charles Perrault's tales get reintroduced into the folk culture. So that now, we moms tucking our kids into bed who are just telling them the oral story of Cinderella are telling them Charles Perrault's version. Right? Fairy godmothers and 12 o'clock curfews and all these things, and we don't even realize that we've done the the PBS politically correct version with the didactic ending. So the true folk tale is different from the literary tale. So what's one of the things I try to really emphasize is folk tale versus literary tale. Hans Christian Andersen is also somebody who was not writing down folk tales, but was making up original works. And so he writes literary fairy tales. So there is no Little Mermaid or Steadfast Tin Soldier that exists in the oral tradition. He made these up. Now that doesn't mean they're bad. It just means you take them on the terms of it. These are short stories of German Romanticism. They're excellent, and there's a reason why they have stood the test of time. He was a tremendous lover of fairy tales, but they're not folk tales. Right, so you're not going to pick up a Grimm and find the Little Mermaid in there because Hans Christian Andersen made that up, right? So that's your basic categories for your folk tale and your literary tale, and I think I've covered all of it.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Okay, so I have a couple thoughts like have all been like racing through my mind. One is like so things based on fairy tales not having any kind of link to a specific place or time, something that someone might hear, oh, Spencer's the Fairy Queen, that must be a fairy tale, is actually not, because it is in the court of King Arthur, and you have these sort of, even though it is fantastical, it's linked to, real people and places. But then I was also thinking, I was like, well, maybe Star Wars is really a modern fairy tale because it's in a galaxy.
My students jump right on that. And when we start breaking down how the characters function in stories and fairy tales and how the characters goes on a quest and what characters do they meet and what obstacles do they overcome, my students are always like, Star Wars. Star Wars is, I know it gets called myth, but really it's a fairy tale. Luke Skywalker is an everyman on a quest to figure out who he is, which is very often what your fairy tale hero is. Now, just as an aside, since you brought up the Fairy Queen, which I'm completely obsessed with, so Spencer is not fairy tale per se, he's writing a romance. And so a romance is a highly literary version of a fairy tale. So it follows the structure of a fairy tale. It will have that redemptive ending. It will have many, many, many fairy tale elements. But because it's a romance, it's going to be a little more rooted in a place. So Narnia is more of a romance, right? Because it starts with kids in a specific place and then they go to another world. So when the story sets up that way, where you're going into a fairy world, that's a romance. So they go into the fairy world and then there's a lot of fairy tale elements. For example, when you go into Narnia, he makes the point that you neither know where you are nor when you are. So he does, once they leave England and they go into Narnia, he does do the displacement of time and space each time. And then they go there and they come back. So there's a lot of similarity, but it's not a fairy tale proper. It's a romance. And Lewis, being a Spenser scholar and a medievalist, is very, very intentional about that.
Yeah, I think I've heard you, I think it was you who said that Narnia is like a Spenser fan fiction or something.
Yes, it is. It 100%. C.S. Lewis was the world's the greatest living Spenser scholar. He probably still is. And yes, Narnia is absolutely Spenser fan fiction.
Okay, so can we have then, if we have literary fairy tales that aren't based in the folk tradition that you mentioned, like Hans Christian Andersen and some of the French fairy tales, not the Charles Perrault guy, but some other ones.
Everyone's going to go out and burn their Charles Perrault. My job is done. I haven't even told you the worst of this guy. You just got the mini version.
So is it appropriate could there be something written like in the modern age that would be a modern, that we could call like a modern fairy tale if it was fitting those rules? Okay, so it's not, fairy tale is about a genre, not about something that was old.
That's right. So, someone could still write a literary fairy tale. Absolutely. So over time, we lost the distinction between folktale and fairy tale, so that we now refer to the folk tales as fairy tales. And this is where it gets so confusing, because you go into Hans Christian Andersen expecting that these are folk tales, and and you're like, well, what's the Chinese version of the Little Mermaid? Well, there isn't one, right? And so if we can just keep that distinction in our mind and remember that some of these tales are coming from the oral tradition and have been passed down over time, and some of them are just complete works of the imagination.
Okay, this is so exciting. I feel like I just need to stop and think for a minute, but we've got to move on. Okay, why is it important for Christians to read fairy tales? I have heard some people argue that it is not good for Christians to read fairy tales, but I would argue it's important. I would love to hear why you think it's important.
Okay, I'll try to give you the nutshell here. This is my passion. This is my hill to die. You know it is. This is my hill to die on. Okay, so I will try to divide my thoughts into two basic ideas. Okay, so one, I'm going to approach it this way. The things that sort of make you cautious and uncomfortable about fairy tales are precisely why you need to read them. So in the modern age, we are materialists. In other words, our presumptions about reality is what is real is what we can touch, taste, see, right, hear, experience through the senses. That's all, that's what's real. Anything that's not experienced by the senses is not real. So now we've ended up in a situation where God, by this definition, is not real. Goodness, virtue, truth, beauty, goodness, these things don't exist because I cannot experience them with my senses. And so here we are in this emaciated age where we have just sucked the soul out of reality by redefining reality as what can be experienced in the senses. Our steady diet of realistic literature and realistic movies means that we are over and over and over subjecting ourselves to the lie that the only thing is real is what I can see. Now, as a Christian, we know that's a lie, right? We're constantly battling that lie. We're constantly saying, no, this is my momentary light affliction, right? This is not what's real. And we're constantly saying, no. God exists. You just can't experience him through the senses, right? We're constantly saying, no, there is a reality that is in fact the greater reality that transcends our senses, right? So what fairy tales do is they reintroduce wonder and mystery into our lives. Fairy tales teach us over and over that there is more than meets the eye, right? This wardrobe door might actually be a magic portal into another world. This lion might be something else, right? This flower might be something else. Everything is just infused with all this deep meaning. And our age has just, we are at a war with wonder and mystery. We have no place for wonder and mystery. And our souls are just absolutely shriveling up because of this. Because we live in an age of rationalism in which we think to comprehend things with our minds is to know them, right? But there is so much about our Christian walk that is mysterious and beyond the rational mind, right? And I'm not suggesting it's all irrational. Simply that some things are beyond the irrational. When you have a religious experience, a conversion experience, and you try to explain that to someone who's an unbeliever, they'll give you all kinds of rap. Oh, you were just fevered, and you were just scared, and you were just like, and you're saying, no, it was the truest thing I've ever felt. I felt the Holy Spirit come into me. I'm a new person, right? Well, that's beyond the rational mind, what you're describing, right? So we know there are all these mysteries, the Trinity. I always use that as my go-to example, because what could be more beyond the rational mind? 3 is 1 and 1 is 3, and they're all separate, but they're all one. I mean, you could spend the rest of your life trying to figure that out. Your rational brain is not going to wrap itself around that ever. At some point, you're just going to say, I believe all these seemingly opposing statements to be true, right? Christianity is infused with so much paradox. We have the living God who died. We die to ourselves to live. We put ourselves last to be first. Over and over, there's these paradoxes, right? Which defy the rational mind. And so we live day to day with our wonder and our sense of mystery assaulted. And so when you read a fairy tale, you enter a land of wonder and mystery. You enter a land where you cannot trust your senses, because what you see might be an evil enchantment, right? And more about that later, because that's my big thing there. But so that's my first point, that fairy tales reintroduce wonder, and they reintroduce a transcendent sense. So in fairy tales, when fairies come and they use magic, so just the whole the idea that we live in a magical, enchanted universe. There was a time when, in the Middle Ages, when all Christians thought we lived in a magical, enchanted universe, right? By which they meant there were so many things that I can't explain, that I don't understand. The world is full of mystery. We would say something a little more rational. It's like the Holy Spirit is somehow involved in the creation. But we think if we say it like that, it's somehow more sophisticated than saying it's magic, right? C.S. Lewis would say the Holy Spirit is magic. John Milton would say the Holy Spirit is my muse. But the idea that the world is infused with a transcendent meaning that is beyond the rational mind is an idea that has historically been accepted, and is now we're at war with that. And so we're constantly having to fight our tendency to think what is real is what I can experience through the senses. So that's one idea.
One thing it makes me think of is actually thinking about the Book of Ecclesiastes, and how, the author of Ecclesiastes is talking about, when I look out at this world as it's under the sun, under the sun, under the sun, and that idea is repeated over and over and over again, and it's all vanity and despair and meaninglessness, and yet what he's really pointing you to is there's something beyond the sun, right? So God himself, the Logos, the one who is reason, is outside of the system because he created this system. And so it's beyond a lot of things that we look at our world through our finite, earthbound perspective. And maybe it's not even that it's not that it's irrational. It's like, it's so rational that our finite human mind is unable to contain it because it's outside the system.
Exactly. And there's a very real sense in which our day-to-day lives are lived under an evil enchantment. And we have to desperately be delivered from that. And that leads me to my second point. I'm fond of saying fairy tales are realer than real and truer than true. And that is because the basic structure of a fairy tale, as I said before, it has a redemptive pattern. Well, that redemptive pattern is a gospel pattern, and they all follow that, okay? This is why in fairy tales, dead princesses get rescued by princes, right? We have all these characters going through these death and resurrection moments. So you take something like Sleeping Beauty, right? Sleeping Beauty is almost a pure example of the gospel story, right? The Sleeping Beauty is cursed on her death, right? By nothing she has done, she has born into a curse of death. A fairy comes forward and says, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to turn the curse of death into a sleep. Well, boom, there's Paul right there, right? What does Christ do to that evil enchantment we're born under? He says it's not going to be death. It's going to be a sleep. Now, the curse, of course, is she's going to prick her finger. The thorn. The thorn goes back to Eden. That's the curse in Eden. Now thorns are going to prick us. So what's going to happen? She's going to prick her finger and she's going to die. So her father says, not on my watch, right? I'm going to destroy all the thorns. perfect example of the attempt to earn our salvation through works righteousness. I can do something. I can avoid this curse we're born under. Of course, it doesn't work. She pricks her finger, right? And what happens next? The whole kingdom falls under this sleeping curse, right? The whole kingdom dies, right? And that's one of the beautiful things about fairy tales. Not just her individually, the whole world died, right? What happens? She lays unconscious, hedges of thorns grow up around her. I mean, hello, this girl is trapped in the curse of Eden, right? People begin to hear stories of this beautiful princess asleep who needs to be rescued, just like we do, right? We need someone to rescue us from this evil enchantment we're under. The princes come, every one of them gets caught up by the thorns and dies, right? Until the story tells us when the time was right. In the fullness of time, the true prince shows up. And what happens when he shows up and confronts this hedge of thorns? My favorite moment. I always get the chills. I'm the chills right now just thinking about it. The thorns turn into flowers. His appearance has reversed the curse of the Garden of Eden. They part. He goes in. He awakens her with a kiss. The curse is lifted on her and the whole kingdom. And then he marries her. And then they live happily ever after, which is how every fairy tale ends, because this is our story. We are the enchanted princess on their curse. We are waiting for the prince to come and wake us up and lift the curse and say, you are now my bride, which is, of course, that is the language that scripture uses. Jesus is the bridegroom. We are the bride. We are sitting around waiting for our bridegroom to show up and rescue us. And all fairy tales have at their heart that same redemptive pattern. I teach classes on this, and that's what my fairy tale book will be about too. All the different variations of that pattern as you see in fairy tales. But they're all walking us, in these fairy tales, it's walking with us through the gospel story every single time.
And that great ending that we know that we look forward to, that we don't have yet, but we know is coming, and it is sure that it will be happily ever after. For
exactly. And in Snow White, when the prince wakes up Snow White from her death, he takes her back to his father's kingdom. I mean, it's just so beautiful. And so one of the ways you need to approach fairy tales is that each fairy tale story is a miniature gospel story, but each of them together is telling a different component of the gospel story. So some are going to be focused on more the resurrection. Some might be focused more on the fall, or on this aspect, or of Christ the bridegroom, or of Christ our brother, or of God the Father from whom we're in exile. They're all focusing on a slightly different version of it. But the more you study it, the more you realize, this is this gospel, this is this, this is this. And it's just beautiful. It's the kind of thing you can never get to the end to, right? I mean, I just want to weep when people say, well, I'm afraid of fairy tales. I think you're afraid of the gospel. Or if they say, I don't want to read fairy tales because that's escapism. Like it's escapism from the lie we live in, from the delusion we're in. And it's an entrance into the truest truth that there is, that we are under an evil enchantment, desperately in need of our prince to come and rescue us.
Yeah, it's telling the big story that we are all in the midst of.
Exactly. And this is why the oral folk tradition is so fascinating to me. That means that story is written on every human being's heart all over the world, all over time. It's a story we can't stop telling. Yeah. That's what's so fascinating to me. Wherever you look, there it is, there it is, there it is, right?
And across cultures too.
That's right, across cultures, across times. There is no place in the world that you can't find the parts of this story in some version. And for me, I gotta tell you, this ends up being the reason why I'm a Christian, because it's everywhere I look. It's the story everywhere I look. I've devoted my life to studying stories, and there is not a story I have ever read that I don't find that right in the middle of it. And for me, there's only one reason that could be true, because it is the true story. Yeah. And every act of sub-creating, to use Tolkien's term, every act of sub-creating then is just a reflection of the story that we're living in.
Yeah, I wrote an article about why it's important to study mythology relatively recently. And it's that exact same idea. You know, people often are concerned about studying world mythology with their children because it's like, well, then they'll think, well, maybe the Bible is a myth. And no, if anything, world mythology points us to the truth of Romans 1, that the truth of God is written in our hearts. And it's fractured and broken because we're blind and dead, but it's there. And so to see it across people and places and time I don't know, it makes me so excited. It points me to the truth.
Too. It makes me excited too. And to speak to your point, this is why Lewis said Christianity is true myth, right? So you don't have to worry that somebody says, is Christianity a myth? Well, the answer is yes, it is. It's just the true myth, right? And again, myth is one of those literary terms like fairy tale that you have to define, right? Myth actually just means a creation story. The stories of the time before men. That is literally the definition of myth. We have decided in our rationalistic age that myth equals a false story. That is not the definition of myth. Myth is just a type of story. And so when Lewis says Christianity is a myth, of course, being the devout believer that he was, he doesn't mean Christianity is not true. He's saying Christianity is the story of God and the creation of the world and what happened before men and the story of the beginnings of men and the origins of men. But it's unlike these other myths, it's the true myth, right? And so I say the same thing about fairy tales, right? When I say the gospel is a fairy tale, don't mean it's a fake story. I mean, it's a type of story that's a fairy tale. It's about a bridegroom coming to slay the dragon and rescue the princess. And that's all right there in the scriptures, all the language that scriptures use, right? I didn't make this up. They call Jesus the bridegroom. They in Revelation talk about him slaying the dragon, right? They talk about the metaphor all the time of we are the bride of Christ, and are we being the adulteress? Are we running off with others? Are we staying true to our true husband, right? The language, that's the language scripture uses for itself. And so Christ is the true fairy tale prince. He is the story that all these others are shadows of. He's the true character.
Yeah. Well, how do we introduce this then to our young children? Because I guess I have a couple kind of layers to this question. One, there are aspects of some of the fairy tales that are very disturbing and violent, and that can be a concern for some families. Or then maybe someone's listening to this and is like super excited, and they sit down with their little 4-year-old and they're like, and now let me also expound to you all of the meanings behind this fairy tale. Which probably is not a good idea. But how do we and when do we begin introducing fairy stories to our children?
Okay, that's a great question. I get this question a lot, especially scenario number 2. Somebody listens to me give a talk on fairy tales and is like, that's it, we're stopping everything. The rest of our school is just going to be fairy tales. And their eyes are this big and they say, how should I explain this gospel stuff to my 5-year-old? I said, whoa, don't, right? There are stages to this, right? So if you're introducing them into the wonder of a fairy tale, the last thing you want to do is destroy that wonder by slapping on a Charles Perrault moral at the end because you're worried they didn't get the point, right? So no, you just read them because this is what happens. They internalize the pattern. Can your 6-year-old say all fairy tales end in a happy ending? No. Have they internalized that? Absolutely they have. They have internalized the prince is going to come and rescue you on a level in which they cannot articulate. Now, when they're older, so I find that in my middle school class, my favorite students are the ones who've just had years and years and years of morning time. They've just been filled up with stories. So then I come in and I start explaining how stories work. And here's the prince, and here's the mentor, and here's the hero on his journey. And the kids are like, oh, well, that's like, and they're just like rattling off. Like, I'm not even kidding. They'll just blow up 10, 20 stories. Shakespeare plays. All of a sudden, every story they've ever read pops into place, right? So you don't have to, again, resist that modern urge to be didactic and to make sure they can rationally articulate. They don't need to, at least not now, maybe even never, because if they read fairy tales and feel a deep comfort, that's the point. That's the point, right? So that would be my answer to the scenario of number 2 there. No, slow down, resist the urge to Charles Perrault it, right? And that, boys and girls, is why Jesus is the prince. No, let them sit in the wonder of it, okay? Let them sit in the wonder of it. The other thing is about the disturbing elements. Yes, there are. And I have a couple of different answers to that. One, parents are more disturbed by the weird than the kids. Like 100% of the time. We're like, I mean, this happened to me. I was reading Andrew Lang to my kids when they were little, and in my head I'd be like, what the what? And then the snake did what? I'm looking at their faces like, are they going to yell at me to stop? And when I finish, they're like, well, that's good. We'll take another one. I mean, just like not even a blip on their radar. So adults, we have a lot more to overcome, right? Edith Nesbit has a wonderful essay called The Wings of the Child. It's about the imagination. And she says that we have to understand the whole world is magical to a kid, right? Gravity, that's magic, right? We've made sense of the world, but when you're a kid, everything's weird, everything's magical, everything's unknowable, right? So they don't have these categories that we do, and they can enter into these stories much, much easier than we can. It's our challenge to reclaim our childlike sense of wonder, right? When Christ says you have to have the faith of a child to enter heaven, I am absolutely convinced he's talking about wonder. You have to have that wonder. And I think fairy tales help for that. So children naturally have that. So that's one thing. You're probably worried about nothing. Now, that is not to say that there are not some children who are exceptionally sensitive. That is correct. And if you as the parent, again, not judging your own uncomfortableness, but if your child is genuinely freaked out, if they are having nightmares, then don't push that. Okay, there are plenty of fairy tales that you can pick and choose. If you stick with the big ones, Cinderella and things like that, that's probably not going to give anybody nightmares unless you have stepsisters. But
it's like, wait, which version is the one where they get rolled down with the barrels and the nails?
Yeah, right. So certainly use your judgment about that, and you can pick and choose if a child is sensitive. I have a good friend who I was discussing this with, and she has a highly sensitive child, and her insights were really interesting. So she had started reading the fairy tales when the child was like 4 or 5, and the child began having nightmares. But this woman was such a lover of fairy tales, she's like, can't be that, it can't be that. But she went ahead and listened to her gut, and she pulled back on the fairy tales. She said she waited a year and reintroduced them, and it was a completely different experience. That a year later, the child felt deep comfort, was not having the nightmares anymore. And when she had fears, it was like, well, no, because I know the valiant prince can slay this for me. And she began engaging with the fairy tales exactly like we think kids would. So you can certainly do that. You don't have to feel the need to read every weird, dark one.
Right. This isn't some like new checklist you have to do. Sorry, kids. Angelina said it was important, so stop crying.
I love it when the parents read some weird one. They're like, I trust you, the gospel's in here, but I can't see it.
I have to tell you this really fascinating story. It just happened with my youngest son. So, well, he just turned 5, but this happened like right before he turned 5. And he's the youngest of 5. So frankly, he's watched a lot of things. My oldest son is always like, I didn't get to see that till I was 10 years old.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, he's seen like the Star Wars and the Marvel movies or whatever. Stuff like that's actually kind of violent and intense. And I'm always like, Isaac, is this scary? And he's all like, oh, no, Mom, this is great. It's fine. And he's never had any issues. So we were going to have a family movie night, and we decided to watch this little documentary, like sweet little Disney thing, but it was about dolphins and the reef. So it was nonfiction to learn about the animals, but sort of told in this sweet little way. Oh, what could go wrong with this? Well, you have animals eating other animals, but nothing violent on the screen, much less violent than any of the stories we had seen. And my son was like curled up in a ball on our lap. Like he was so disturbed through this film. And I was thinking to myself, like, there was nothing visually aggressive on the screen. I would never have watched that movie and thought, oh, this would be inappropriate for my little child. But his mind, he knew the difference. Mm-hmm. This is imagination. This is a story that's not real. And he could fully engage in those stories. But when these are actual animals, there's actually like that fish has actually been separated from its mother or whatever. He was distraught. And I thought that was so fascinating at such a young age. It really just showed to me what I've always said, and it was then the example, like children know what's real and what's imagination. Maybe real is the wrong word, because we're talking about real things, but they understand that distinction between fiction and nonfiction.
Absolutely. And again, we should go back to the idea that sometimes kids are disturbed by things you wouldn't be disturbed by. In my middle school class, I was explaining to them the cannibalistic theme in fairy tales. There's a lot of that, the witch wants to eat you, the evil queen wants to eat you. And I was explaining that there is a gospel reason for that. And they just blossom when I start explaining it to them. Anyway, the point was, at the end of that, I said, so, now you don't have to be disturbed. And now you know the answer to why it is that the bad guys are always trying to eat the kids in these stories. And one of the kids raised her hand. This is middle school. This was adorable. And she said, oh, I've never been bothered by the cannibalism. It's the kissing that grosses me out.
I love it.
So, out of the mouth of babes, there you go, right? So the things that we're sort of tiptoeing around is like, oh, that's never bothered me. Oh, kissing at the end, that's so gross.
All right, it's like the Princess Bride movie. Is this going to be a kissing book?
Exactly.
Well, if someone is sort of wanting to get into this and is new to fairy tales, what resources or books or collections of fairy tales would you recommend? And then if someone already loves fairy tales but is looking to go a little deeper, what would you suggest for them as well?
Okay, so I think you can't go wrong with Grimm's. I'm a huge Grimm's fan, and one of the best translations is Jack Zipes' translation of Grimm's. Yeah, so I would actually just recommend flipping through a Grimm's. Another very fine collection is Andrew Lang's books.
Tolkien notwithstanding.
Well, I was going to give the caveat that one thing you need to understand is that Lang was a folklorist, and he was basically just collecting stories that people tell, and he wasn't differentiating the categories. So not only does he have Charles Perrault's version of Red Riding Hood and Cinderella instead of Grimm, which means if you only know Lang, you don't know the happy ending. I was shocked at how many people did not know the happy. I taught a class on Red Riding Hood, and they had never heard the happy ending. So Lang throws it all in there, and at one point, this is what got Tolkien frustrated. He even has in his Book of Fairy Tales an adaptation of Book 1 of Gulliver's Travels, which is right. It's not a fairy tale, and it's not a fairyland. It's a satire of a travel log. But that's what got Tolkien worked up. Like, dude, come on! Gulliver's Travels does not belong in a fairy tale book. So. Lang has a lot of very fine retellings, but if you read it, just be aware that it's not necessarily the folktale version, and he will have things in there that are not actually fairy tale proper. Also, I just feel like as a woman, I need to say it was basically his wife that wrote it. It's his name, but it was his wife that actually did all the work. So we'll just throw out some props to Mrs. Lang. For all your hard work, we thank you.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Did she do the art? I think I have a Tales from Shakespeare with Andrew Lang illustrations, but were those did
really?
His wife do all of the illustrations?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. We're gonna find out.
Yes. Okay. So what about for someone who wants to dive in a little bit more deeply?
Okay, so I would say that the first place you would definitely want to start is Tolkien's essay. This is available anywhere online. It's called On Fairy Stories. And it was a speech he gave, and he talks about the eucatastrophe, which is what I'm calling the redemptive structure. The idea that there's this sudden, unexpected reversal. In other words, Christ dies, we're all crying, sudden, unexpected reversal, surprise! Resurrection actually defeated death. Ha ha, joke's on you, right? And that's at the heart of also, when Sleeping Beauty is dead, and we're all crying, but the prince comes and wakes her up. That's the eucatastrophe, right? The unexpected twist at the end. So he explains that in there. Chesterton and Lewis both have fabulous essays on fairy stories. Both of them big believers in the necessity of children to read fairy tales. Chesterton especially, in only his way, he can be kind of gruff, and we love him for that. But he says things like, look, if you're worried that your kid is scared, and you think if you don't read them fairy stories, they won't be scared. He said, all you have done, you haven't taken away the fear, you've taken away St. George. Now they don't know someone can defeat the dragon. That is all that happens. But if you read these kids' stories, now their bed is surrounded by, the great angelic guard that can protect them. Children are scared of the world, period, right? They are afraid. And when we think that we can somehow guard them from fear by not giving them stories, that's not, we're missing the point. That the fear is deep inside them. It's a scary world we live in. I'm always kind of disappointed when parents are like, well, my kid's can't be scared of the monster in the closet, and so I just told them there's no monster in the closet. Like, when has that ever comforted a person? Right? But to say there are horrible things lurking absolutely in this world, that is a genuine fear, and here is how we can cope with that. Here is how we can defeat it. So the essays of Lewis and Chesterton are wonderful too. On my website, I have lots of resources as well. I've done webinars that I've recorded and for sale on fairy tales. Right now, I think I have up Little Red Riding Hood that I did as part of a conference, and Snow White, and I'm going to be adding to that a Hansel and Gretel recording that I did. So I have more and more resources like that. I've given quite a few talks on fairy tales and the importance of them with these kinds of things, and I'm always referencing a million resources like that. One of the things you have to be careful of when you start studying fairy tales, there can be a lot of Freudian interpretations. There can be a lot of anti-Christian interpretations. When you're studying fairy tales, I feel like you're right up against the gospel. And so you're going to encounter that absolutely when you start reading the scholarship, that there will be people who can say, yes, this is because Jesus is real. And other people making every kind of argument to try to make Jesus not be real. Right? No, these are actually our weird Freudian sexual longings in fairy tales. Yes, there are books like that, and I want to weep. I want to weep. Please do not tell me this fairy tale child has an Oedipal complex. That's nonsense, right? Oh, I mean, but they do. So that would be my caveat. If you start jumping in, you might end up in the deep weird. You might be like, what the heck?
What is just happening to me?
Yeah, exactly. So be prepared. And even, Jack Zipes is a great translator, but he's problematic as a scholar. Because he is not a Christian, and he is definitely reading other things that trying to say, these might be deep-seated human fears, but they're not Christian per se. So yeah. The Grimms, on the other hand, devoutly Christian. I'm actually reading some biographies of them right now. Both brothers deeply Christian, and saw themselves as they collected these tales, as you ready for this, collecting these seeds of an ancient faith. They believed very strongly that what was happening in these fairy tales was evidence of a shared ancient faith, and that we were getting in this distorted form, and that was part of the reason why they wanted to collect them. And they were...
It gave me goosebumps. That's crazy.
Yeah. Oh, the Grimms are absolutely fascinating, both Wilhelm and Jakob. Jakob Grimm especially, huge influence on Tolkien. Both the Grimm brothers were actually huge influences on Tolkien, and both deeply devout men. Who saw them as collecting bits and pieces of the Christian story. And again, that's not something you're going to run into if you're just doing basic fairy tale research. And sometimes, and if you start researching too, you might discover that there are some scholars out there who hate the Grimms because they were Christians. They will argue that the Grimms tried to Christianize pagan myths, by adding certain Christian elements. But the Grimm brothers were extremely devoted folklorists. They were not just going to go in there and rewrite these stories, but what they did do was, when they took the whole breadth of them, the folk tales, and noticed that there would be slight variations, yes, they did shape the ones that they thought were more consistent with an ancient faith. Now, they would not have said or thought that they were changing them. They would have thought they were restoring them, that over time they had sort of gotten dulled, but they felt like there was evidence here and there to support the changes that they made when they looked at the whole German literary tradition. But yeah, just like anything in literature, it's a battleground over religion. It really is. And so, you have to wade cautiously. So Lewis, Tolkien, Chesterton, you're in good hands there. Those guys are all devout. So just don't be shocked if you start Googling Grimm brothers and you run across somebody claiming, oh, they ruined fairy tales. Or sometimes you'll hear, oh, it was German nationalism that led to Hitler. And, you'll just wild stories. But the Grimms were actually very devout and kind of saw themselves as, folklorist missionaries. They're out there preserving these scriptural truths as we found them in other stories.
That is fascinating. Well, as we've just had all these conversations and I'm thinking about these themes and sort of the big picture of fairy tale, the verse that keeps coming to mind is when Jesus tells his disciples and tells us that in this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. And I feel like that really summarizes the main themes or ideas of fairy tales as you've been describing them to us today. So.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing all this. This is so fun, so exciting. I can't wait to type up show notes and get this published. Can you tell people where they can find you all around the internet?
Yes, so you can find me at houseofhumaneletters.com, and I've got links there to my podcast, the Literary Life Podcast. We also, I think by the time this airs, we'll have a sister podcast out called The Well-Read Poem, which will be hosted by my husband, the poet. So you can learn about poetry from a poet, and it's going to be designed to go with morning time. So we're really excited about that project. So I teach year-long classes, summer classes, webinars. I teach adults. I have a wonderful adult class that really takes you kind of step by step in learning how to read and understanding how stories work together, and all these sort of Christian gospel images and stories, how to identify them. Which is that's my passion. Yeah, so you can find me there, and Lord willing, I'll finish this fairy tale book. It just keeps, how the research just keeps growing and growing. Yeah, that's me. Like, I feel like I never know enough to sit down and write. So someone may have to just sit me down and say, just tell us what you know so far, right? That'll be the name of it. The title, What I Know About Fairy Tales So Far, Part 1.
You can always write a sequel later, but you've got to start with what's imperfect. If we wait to be perfect, we'll never get anything done. Right?
I need that on a running loop in my head, because that's not how my brain works.
All right, well, I will talk to you later, and I'm sure I'll be listening to your podcast later this week.
All right, thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Bye.